The House January 6th committee is voting to recommend charging former Trump advisor Steve Bannon with criminal contempt. At the meeting, Republican Congresswoman Liz Cheney said Bannon's avoidance of congressional subpoenas implicates the former president.
Mr. Bannon's and Mr. Trump's privilege arguments do, however, appear to reveal one thing. They suggest that President Trump was personally involved in the planning and execution of January 6th, and this committee will get to the bottom of that.
CBS News legal analyst Rebecca Roiphe joins me now. She is a professor at New York Law School and a former Manhattan prosecutor. Rebecca, welcome. So at the time in question, Steve Bannon did not work for the Trump administration. Can you explain to us how can one argue executive privilege if that's the case?
You know, the parameters of executive privilege are really vague, in part because it hasn't been tested in court much. So the idea behind the executive privilege is we want to promote full and frank conversations between advisors and the president. So I suppose one might argue for an expansive view of the privilege that there are advisors who are outside of the administration as well. And this seems like a very weak argument, and you combine that with the fact that this is being asserted by a former president, not a current president, and that the committee is looking into wrongdoing, and that claim for executive privilege begins to look extremely weak.
Well, here's what Democratic Congressman Jamie Raskin had to say about Steve Bannon's executive privilege argument. Let's listen to that.
It's an utterly laughable claim. It's an absurd claim. For one thing, he didn't even work for President Trump. He didn't work for the executive branch of government. So even if you thought Donald Trump had an executive privilege, it would not transfer to Steve Bannon. He's got no privilege. Maybe he's got a privilege against self-incrimination. He could plead the fifth the way any American citizen could if he thinks he's going to incriminate himself. Of course, we can offer him use immunity, which means we won't use anything against him in a prosecution.
I mean, do you think Steve Bannon could make any case for executive privilege?
I think he can delay things by suggesting possibly that the executive privilege should be interpreted in this broad way. But as I said before, it really does seem like a stretch for executive privilege to extend to someone who doesn't work in the administration, and especially when the public is trying to uncover wrongdoing. So both of those things push in the direction of opening up this information and not leaving it secret. And I think the executive privilege has always been an accommodation between this privacy interest and full and frank conversations and the public interest in transparency. So I think it really leans in favor of transparency here.
Well, former White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows has retained top GOP lawyer and former Deputy Attorney General George Terwilliger. What does that signal, Rebecca, for how Meadows is approaching this investigation?
It signals that he's taking it very seriously. He's hiring somebody who has a lot of experience within the Department of Justice, is a serious lawyer. This is not a joke, and I think that means that he thinks he might, in fact, be in real legal jeopardy if he doesn't cooperate.
Well, this all comes back to former President Trump's attempts to assert executive privilege, something that is supposed to allow a president, as you said, to have private policy conversations with advisors without having records revealed publicly. Why would it ever be within the public interest to grant that secrecy? And do you think that applies here?
I do think that it is important as a matter of separation of powers to have some executive privilege, because the executive branch needs to be able to, get into a boardroom and really think things through and not be afraid that something that somebody says that's wrongful or will get publicized. And so, in the same way that people need to have conversations with their lawyers, it's an important value, but it's an important value that has an endpoint. And the endpoint is the point at which the public interest dictates that it go a different way. And for the reasons that I suggested before, it really seems here that the public interest so clearly points in the other direction, and the executive privilege claim here is weak.
All right, Rebecca Roiphe for us. Rebecca, thank you very much.
Thanks.